Carly, thanks so much for being on Bold Mercies today. We are so glad that you have been willing and chosen to be a guest today on the podcast.
Thank you so much for having me, Heather. Appreciate it.
So, can you just start off by telling us a little bit about yourself? We would love to know, who is Carly?
Yes, I can try. I married my best friend from high school. He was my high school sweetheart. We've been married almost 20 years this year. I love to write and sing and drink coffee and eat delicious food with my friends and travel when possible. So that's kind of what I try to do to
Great.
have fun.
And I have you on here today to talk a little bit about your motherhood journey. And so, can you just kind of just start by giving us an introduction about that? Tell us about you and you as a mom.
Okay. So I had my first child. She was born within the first year of our marriage, and she's now 19 years old. And then we adopted a little boy from Liberia about 3 years later or so, almost 4 years after that. And so we adopted him from Liberia, and then we entered into the foster care system. And so we were foster parents for about 10 years. We recently closed our license from that chapter of our lives, but we adopted a little girl out of the system as well. And so we have a very mixed family of how people came to be in it, how we wove them in. So we have a biological child and two adopted children in our midst. And we've parented so many kids. I can't even, I can't even count how many, but, and it's been an amazing experience and we've learned so much from each child. It's been incredible for us. So
Hmm.
hard, but incredible. So,
Yes,
yeah.
like all of parenting, but you've had some
hmm
really special challenges, unique challenges, I should
hmm
say. And so we are just going to both agree that our children's stories are our children's stories. And I've said this before here on the podcast. And so we just cannot share those stories publicly, but we can talk about your journey as a mom and
Yeah.
wrestling through those difficulties and those ups and downs and just mostly focusing our time on talking about God's faithfulness and his mercies and how he's shown up in the darkest times and in the storms and has held you and comforted you, given you wisdom and clarity and direction. And so that's kind of where we're going to focus just the bulk of our interview today. So I would love to just ask you, like, what are some really massive life lessons that you have learned through this parenting journey that you've been on?
Oh my gosh. I thought I was ready for that question, but I'm not. Um, so the big what I want to say, I think what I want to say first is that number one, um, the three of my kids, the journeys that we've been on with them, because they each have been impacted by chronic illness of some sort or another, is that they're all three walking miracles. And because God has provided at every turn, maybe it took longer than we thought. Maybe it was a road that was more windy than seemed necessary or very isolating.
Hmm.
But it has been one of those things where God just shows up right at the 11th hour for all of us. So what I could say is that my motherhood mostly in all of this has been um, a journey about healing and fighting for my kids. And so what I will say is that my oldest son, he was diagnosed with epilepsy when he was young. So kind of this era or season we've been in has been a little over a decade now. And he was diagnosed with epilepsy. And then both my daughters were, they both had an acute onset of neurological and psychiatric symptoms. And we found out many years after their initial onset of symptoms that they had what was called autoimmune encephalitis. And they each have two different kinds. But we've spent many years in isolation,
Mm.
trying to care for each child. And I realized after the fact, here we are 10 years later, that that time of severe loneliness and isolation
Mm.
and no answers and what felt like silence from God was a time that he was preparing me, kind of like it talks about the story of Elijah, right? Where he goes through a period where he's in the wilderness or by a stream and he's just waiting for that,
Mhm.
whatever it is that God has. But he's not waiting just with no purpose. God
Yeah.
has a reason for that period of time where he has him alone. And so I definitely went through that. I only know that now. I didn't know
Yeah.
that at the time, that God
Yes.
was preparing me for the miracles, the fire he was going to cast down, right? Like he did for Elijah.
I love
And
that.
so what was interesting is that not only did my children all have become diagnosed with significant rare disorders, when my oldest daughter was at the zenith of her illness, just the hardest time, we couldn't get her, she was always in the hospital. We had no answers for her because she was misdiagnosed for 6 years. When this was going on, I was actually diagnosed with breast cancer. So that
Mhm.
took me into a whole new level of parenting while ill myself.
Ill. Mm.
And so it was an interesting thing though, because we were finally able at that same time to figure out what her illness actually was. And it was like I said, an autoimmune disorder with neuropsychiatric symptoms. It's called PANDAS, and it's called pediatric autoimmune neuropsychiatric disorders associated with strep. So strep is what started everything
Mm.
for her. But at the time, like I said, they all thought she had a whole laundry list of all these different psychiatric disorders and neurological disorders that just didn't make any sense. So when we got her diagnosed, while I'm getting ready to have this awful mastectomy and go through all this treatment
Yeah.
for breast cancer, my husband and my dad whisked her off from the hospital she was at to Chicago, to a leading specialist in Chicago. And she got immune therapy there for the first time. And after 6 years, roughly, of intense suffering, she began to heal.
Mm.
And we had tried everything up to that point. And
Mhm.
so it was just an interesting time where I'm going through my
Yeah.
thing and she's going through hers, and we're both getting healing at the same time in different ways, right? For totally
Yes.
different issues. But God was so present and he provided and he covered. That was a big one for me during that time, was God showing himself faithful through all of that, whether it was friends or family showing up, people praying for us all over the world, while we were in the middle of this intense crisis. But
Mm.
that was the beginning of breaking these cycles for her, um, of oppression and just intense illness. So
Mm.
um,
Mm.
I don't know if that
I
answers your question.
It
I'm
does. And
sorry.
I
Okay.
want to hit on this idea of healing again, but I want to actually backtrack in your story because you had
Yeah.
talked about isolation. And I think
Hmm.
that for moms who are parenting children with, like, for a variety of reasons that would make them feel isolated, whether it's a special needs child or a child who has a disease, so they're spending so much time in the hospital, or a child or a mom that feels like she can't go out with the child because they will create such disruption in the community. And so, for whatever reason, there's a lot of reasons why moms can feel isolated. And you walk through that season, which was obviously, from the way that you're talking about it, so, so hard. So, if you were speaking to a mom who's in the middle of that isolation and just feeling like there really is no light at the end of the tunnel, what is some things that you would really want her heart to know?
Yes. I would say that the I would want her heart to know that it is a time of preparation and you can't even know what for.
Hmm.
Because, I've sat with my girls through times where I thought, God, what good could you possibly pull out of this? Like, there's no good to be found here. Like, this is just they can't even learn from this. This isn't something they can learn from. And in that isolation, I started reading the Psalms of David just
Hmm.
every night. And I still do it because even if I have other Bible studies, other things going on, David speaks to that isolation and that loneliness, but he also speaks to the victories and he speaks to all the human experience that
Hmm.
we travel through, and it's real and it's raw, and sometimes life is raw.
Yeah.
And it's um that has given me so much perspective in the middle of it, and just recognizing that no, I'm not alone. We are seen. Um, God is with us, even if it feels like He's being silent.
Hmm.
And that has been very instrumental in sustaining my faith during some very, very dark times. And um, I'm not sure. Well, I mean, I'm not sure what else to say beyond that because everybody's story is different. So I can't say that
Yes.
the miracles around the corner because sometimes,
It's just not.
sometimes we don't. Yeah, sometimes our suffering is not about us, even if we're in the middle of it ourselves. And so the thing that I could give you as an example is I had a little foster son, and he loved the police. Whoever rescued him from his
Hmm.
situation did an amazing job, like really made him feel like this important um, little person that he was. And he just was in awe of every police officer he ever saw, every police car. So
Hmm.
when I was diagnosed with breast cancer, I actually had to say goodbye to him because I couldn't care for him
Yeah.
anymore, and the girls with all of this. So I had to take him to his next placement, which broke my heart. Like this all was happening all at the same time, and I
Yeah.
had to say goodbye
Wow.
to him. And I love him so much. And I was just like, God, I don't know how to do this. Why are you taking this sweet boy? I can't do this. And so I pack him up in the car, and I'm driving about 45 minutes away to the next place. And all along, it's late at night, and all the way there from my house all the way to his new home, we see police cars driving by, speeding by with their sirens going, woo, 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 right?
Yeah.
And every time, and I had told him, I said, okay, well, the police say we have to go to the next house. I'm so sorry, but now you have to meet your new foster mommy. They decided that you have to do this. So the whole way there, every like 3 to 5 minutes, Mom, look, another
Oh.
police car. And we're going the right way, Mom, to my new
Oh.
mom. And so, like, God took what I had told him, and it made him other people's suffering ultimately on the other ends of those sirens, right? Like,
Yeah.
those police cars were going somewhere we weren't, and it was going to something disastrous. They always are, right?
Yeah.
And so it was other people's suffering
Hmm.
that like led this little boy and helped him
Hmm.
to see that, like, you know right way to the next place. So there was that peace for
Yeah.
him,
I love
right?
that.
And so that has stuck with me since that day. And I didn't even cry because
Yeah.
when I had to say goodbye, because he just was like, "Yep, okay, this is where I'm supposed to be because the police
Oh,
said
the
so."
police said so. Oh, I love
Yeah.
that.
And so, yeah,
I think that
that's kind of
also I love that story about how God provided for that sweet little foster boy, how he loved how God loved him so much just to provide that along the way, just to ease his
Mhm.
just to calm his nerves and to ease any fears that he was feeling. And as well, I also really like your application time that you said that you were spending that time really in the Psalms because it
Mhm.
gives voice to your lament in a way maybe that your heart
Yeah.
isn't able to form the words. And so that is such a good application point there, just to kind of have that hope that God is going to be using this in preparation, and then to find those words in the Psalms, those words of lament that you can really express what's going on in in your heart through that time. Carly, your story also, like you said another thing. You said a lot of profound things, but one more thing that you had said is like, oh, you paused and you're like, it's so hard to know everybody's story because I can't promise the big miracle, right? And none of us can. Like we hold out hope that God is going to be close and present and real, but we don't know if it's the miracle's going to go the way that we want it to go or not. And although you have been able to fight for and find some treatments for your children, like your story still isn't tied up with this pretty bow, right? Like
No.
you are still in the middle of the fight of the battle, and it's not like it's like,
Mhm.
well, that was a really hard season and now we are beyond it and life is so much easier. It's like,
Mm-mm.
like you are in the middle of that battle. And so what are some things that you've learned about God that has really
Mhm.
sustained you for the long haul?
Yeah. So one of the first things that I learned in all of this very early on, and I stick with it today, it's a reminder today, is that God is less interested in healing our bodies than he is in healing our hearts and souls.
Hmm.
And oftentimes, folks want to pray away and get to the miracle, right? But the problem is you lose the opportunity to learn what God has for you in the middle of this if you're too busy trying to get to that end. Get me better, God, or get my
Oh,
kid better,
yeah.
God.
Hmm.
God has so much to teach us in that suffering, and we have to learn how to suffer. And we have to learn how to get to accept and receive help and assistance from others in the middle of that. I could not do all the things going through chemo and surgeries with my kids. I had to have help, and I had to learn how to let people's need to help you, like that blesses people when they
Yeah.
feel like they can practically, in some practical way, show you love and support.
Hmm.
And because I know it brings that for me when I can help and support friends and
Yeah,
church
for
members
sure.
and things like
Hmm.
that. And so you have to remember that it goes both ways, and you're going to have seasons where you have to learn to receive that support, but you also have to be able to ask for it. And I'm still working on that,
Mm.
um, because I need my people. All right. And God uses those people to buoy us
Yeah.
through.
Yeah, for
And if I
sure.
don't have that, I have to. Isolation can be a period that God chooses for you, but can also be a period where your choices or your inability
Mm.
to reach out and ask isolates you unnecessarily. And then you lose out on a lot of what God has to say and offer you through
Mm.
other people, whether they're believers or not. Because I've seen God use people who are not believers to really help me through times. And I needed them, and I
Yeah.
still do.
Yeah.
So that's one of the big things. And just that God is so faithful. We've already said that. He is so faithful. With the situations, the circumstances we're in with our daughters, tough decisions are having to be made sometimes daily because we go
Oh
into
my. Yeah.
crisis. And so
Mhm.
we have to make difficult decisions. We have to survive long hospital stays and still somehow maintain a family unit.
Yeah.
Um, and one of the things God has given us and endowed us with instincts. And
Mhm.
part of reading the Psalms of David and part of immersing yourself in the Bible every day is kind of sharpening that spiritual sensitivity and those human instincts that we innately have.
Yeah.
And relying upon him has helped me learn how to move forward in peace in these decisions while leaving behind anything that stirs up unrest or conflict inside of me. And so peace isn't always just sitting still and just accepting, accepting the just that. It's not just an overwhelming feeling, right?
Yes.
Of
Right. Right.
transcendence, whatever.
Mhm.
It's
Yeah.
not just that. Peace is often active, and it's taking that next step confidently. Even if you don't know why you're making this step or why you've chosen this route, you just know that this route, I know that this is what God wants simply because the peace is there, like the assurance and confidence is there, and not all the doubt and struggle and fear in that going in that direction. And that's been a huge learning curve for me, and just trusting that everything that God has shown me in scripture over the last month, and the things that he's said to me through friends and different things like that, or pastors or what have you, is how I know next. There isn't like always the Bible doesn't just say, oh, well, if this happens, then do this, and
Right.
this happens,
Right.
then do this. It's
Right.
not that simple, but
Uh-uh.
it's learning that discernment from spending so much time praying and in the word. And it's essential, you know, or I can't make it through. I don't know how people do this without faith because it's impossible.
Hmm.
And yeah. So that's what I would say is, and just as an example, my youngest daughter is still in the throes of healing from her last flare from her
Mhm.
autoimmune encephalitis, and it did a lot of damage to her. And it was very, very scary time. This was just this past fall. And I knew in my heart, just going through and reading every day, like searching God, like, what do I do? We can't get help where we live, and
Yeah.
they don't follow standard of care at the children's hospital down the street. What am I supposed to do? They're the reason we are still not healing her the way she should be. And
Hmm.
so I realized in my reading that if I stay here, we are not getting better. In fact, doom is before us. And so I just realized I have to leave. And I have to leave like this week.
Hmm.
And so I packed her up and I left and I went to Arizona to stay with my family, get some
Mhm.
help from people who weren't in crisis, namely my
Yes.
parents.
Yes.
And then within 2 weeks we got a call to get her to the clinic we'd been trying to for months to get her to in Houston,
Mhm.
to get her the healing, the medical intervention she desperately needed. And I know that if I hadn't, by the time we got there, her disease had derailed so bad that it was 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. And
Wow.
if we were still in where I live now,
Yeah.
um, I wouldn't have been able to travel with her. She would have been so ill
Oh,
we could
yeah.
not travel. And so
Mm.
God had just like I didn't know why I was
Yeah.
leaving yet,
Mm.
but ultimately if I had not left when I did,
Yeah.
I can't tell you where we'd be, but it wouldn't be good. It would
Mm.
be bad.
Mm.
And so yeah, it was one of those moments that I just knew what I was supposed to do and not supposed to do, and I didn't have a good reason why. I just knew I had to take that
Yeah.
next step.
And I love
And
what you
God met us everywhere we went.
And I love what you said, that peace is active, that you that you felt like you had through discernment, through the power of the Holy Spirit, probably through some wise counsel in your life, that you feel like you had a plan, a next step. And so peace was really about taking that next step, to be active and take that next step instead of living in that fear, in that anxiety, but just to take the next step with confidence that God had cleared away. And I also think that it was important that you said that, like, you didn't necessarily have the next 6 months laid out before you. It was just like
Nope.
the next step, right? It was just making
Yeah.
that next
Yeah.
step, and then seeing now that you can look back on that and look back on the fall and seeing how God actually was leading you very confidently through all of those steps, that you could eventually get to Houston. That's just really a powerful lesson, first of all, to learn about God and his faithfulness, and then also a teaching tool for all of us to be able to say, okay, we can walk forward with confidence, and trusting that God has given us if we feel that God has given us instructions, then we can walk forward with confidence in that. That was
Yes.
beautiful. I love that. I know that you have been in this journey for a long time. And so you probably have a
Hmm.
lot of tools in your tool belt now to help you, just spiritually, emotionally, physically, um, be able to walk this journey that is probably going to be for your family, I don't know, like a long haul journey of parenting, which will
Hmm.
change over the seasons as children get older and age
Yeah.
out and leave your home. But so that looks a little different. But what are some of those tools that you would say are really like daily tools in your tool belt that you're able to use, and to strengthen you and encourage you and keep you going in the midst of this?
Yeah. So I think I had mentioned before about how sometimes, suffering is not always about us, and the grief we endure is
Yeah.
not always just about us. Um, I would say that, I mean, I've mentioned it before, daily, daily in God's word,
Mm,
doing anything you can, to stay aligned with the Lord Himself.
mm,
And one of the things that I do is that when starting to feel that sense of loneliness and isolation, what I realized is that I need to be the friend that I wished I'd had when, right? So
wow.
during
Hmm.
that season when I was super isolated, I really did not have many places to turn. There
Mm,
truly was none. Very few. I don't want to discount. There's a lot of people I shouldn't discount, but going through this, no one in our circles had seen what this was and
right.
had no idea what we were
Hmm.
going through, and still probably don't truly get it. And I'm glad for them, because this is not
Yeah.
something I would wish for anyone. And I don't say that in bitterness or anger or anything.
Yes. Hmm.
But what I would say is that when a name comes to mind, when a person comes to the front of my thoughts, I don't think that's ever accidental. So when I'm feeling alone and I do have a minute, I often will do things like reach out to a person that
Wow.
clearly someone God has put on my mind. And even though I'm feeling lonely, if I can do something to lift them,
Yeah.
then that actually lifts me. So
Yeah.
it's not about me, it's
Right.
about loving other people well, even if I'm feeling myself. And then when you do that, it actually lifts, like I said, it lifts you.
Yeah,
And
for
then
sure.
something about doing that. So it's just learning to be sensitive to, I'm not thinking about this person or this situation or circumstance for no reason. This is on my
Mm,
mind for a reason. And maybe you are the person that is supposed to reach out in the middle of their loneliness or isolation or struggle for that day.
mm.
So that's one thing that I do.
That's
And
so good.
um, but it goes back to the story about that I was telling you about my foster son. Sometimes these things aren't about us, but
Yeah.
if we can lift others, it makes a big difference. So that's one of the big things that I do. And then I end up learning so much about God in the middle of it. Because
Yes.
oftentimes I'll do it and have no idea how God is actually working. And then you get to see that. And it's just about joining him where he is, you know?
Yes.
So,
That's such a
and
good
he tries
word.
to, yeah, he tries to throw clues at us, but we're so busy sitting in fear or our
Mm.
own circumstances, so it's
Hmm.
good to get yourself out of them. Also, I read fiction so I can take my mind off of whatever my current situation is. So I bet at night I got to think about something totally different than what my day just looked like, you know? So just things
Absolutely.
like that, you know?
Absolutely. That's like a really good practical advice there. Like just read a fiction book at night. Just like
You
read a
gotta give your
good,
brain a break.
yeah, just read
Yeah.
a good story. That just read a really good
Yeah.
story. Those are
Yeah.
that's some really, really good advice. And thankfully now you've actually found like a really great community. Like you lived in isolation where
Yeah.
people were, and you at first initially probably were like, what is going on? We can't get answers. And I'm sure
Yeah.
your people at that
Yeah.
point were like, what is going on? Distancing themselves or
Yeah.
whatever. But thankfully you have
Yeah.
found a really great community and they've been lifesavers for you, right?
Yes. So when we initially tried to get my daughter treatment, when we realized what this was, and I will let everyone know that for pandas, it wasn't a doctor that helped me get this diagnosed. It wasn't a neurologist that looked at her and said, "Oh, light bulb." No, no, no. It was a friend. A
Mm,
friend who went, "You might want to look into this." And then I didn't want to because it was terrifying because I knew there wasn't anyone here at that time who treated her
yeah.
disease. So the only way I was going to get help is if I left the state. That used to be scary to me. Now I'm like, okay, we're booking a flight,
Yeah.
let's go, you know? And that's but the first time
Yeah,
is terrifying.
terrifying.
And it was a huge risk to take. So um I I would say that I totally lost what you asked
We were
me.
talking
I'm
about,
sorry.
yes, yeah, community and how they've supported
Community.
you.
Okay.
Yeah, that
So
you've
when this
actually
happened,
found it
I'm
now.
sorry. Yeah, so I apologize. There's my chemo brain again. Okay, so yeah, so I went to Chicago and we went through the process of trying to get the payment or it reimbursed this expensive treatment by insurance, and our medical insurance did not cover it. So we had to pay it
Hmm.
completely out of pocket. So, what I did is I contacted someone locally who helps to try to help you advocate for getting reimbursement and doing legislative work and all of that in this region up here. And so I just got immediately involved and said, how do we fight this thing? Because I can't have had all of this suffering up to this point, and I know that there are thousands of children in my state alone who are suffering alongside their families with no hope and no help because nobody is diagnosing this. No one is treating it. These kids are going in and out of psychiatric units, in and out of neurology offices, in and out of juvenile justice, and worse on the streets, everywhere else, because they're
Hmm.
not getting what they need. They don't, regular psychiatric meds and things like that don't help
Hmm.
unless you're treating the autoimmune piece. So all these
Right.
kids are walking around with severe symptoms and no hope, and their families are in distress. And so we have this network in our region where we support families. We have a Facebook page. We table at local medical conferences. We teach people about the illness at all different levels, whether they're school
Hmm.
nurses or school counselors or um, clinics, psychiatric or mental health clinics,
Hmm.
different things like that. We've been trying to educate the state legislators and the senators. And so basically, all of that suffering and all the things we've experienced, I can't stand the idea that without any help or healing,
Hmm.
and there are no resources. I can't make that happen, but at least I can start raising awareness. And
Yeah.
so that's what I do with our local nonprofit. And
Yeah.
so I'm the state outreach coordinator, and I'm also
Okay.
on the board of directors. And
Yeah.
so And at the same time, we support families. Like there are many families in crisis, they end up in the hospital, and oftentimes I'm able to talk with them, help them find a provider, help them find treatment,
Yeah.
or tell them where they can go outside of our state to access help if they can even afford it. So we can raise money, we can do all that stuff to help people pay for treatments. We've been able to do that, and that's been incredible. And I'm just hoping and praying that it will continue to grow, because there are just too many kids out there
Yeah.
like ours, but minus the help, minus
Right.
the intervention,
Right.
and
Right.
so
Right.
I so that's basically where we're at.
I'm
So
so glad you found that community. And I'm so glad too that
mm,
you've used your suffering, which could have really embittered you and made you super angry, but you've used your suffering that you've walked through and you've been able to be a blessing to other people because you walk through that time of suffering. So I'm so thankful that you found that community. It just really is such a good reminder that sometimes we will be in times of isolation and that community is not there. But when you find it, like hold on to them, hold on to
yeah,
them really
yeah.
tight,
Oh yeah.
because they're
Yeah.
so needed.
Yeah.
Are there
Yeah.
any Bible verses that have really just been core or life Bible verses for you?
Well, it depends on the season,
Of
right? Or depends on
course.
the situation. But I will say this, that so for me personally, when I was going through breast cancer and that
Mhm.
weird tunnel of life, that phase of life, um, Psalm 91, just God kept like peppering Psalm 91
Mm.
imagery and all of that at me. I remember people I didn't even who didn't know me well in that faith journey, they would give me a gift and it would have a feather, because it talks about him covering you with his feathers and things like that.
Oh.
They give me some kind of art with feathers on it, or with some reference to Psalm 91, and it was
Oh.
constant during that time.
Wow.
And so I got that sense like, okay, okay, God, I get it. Okay, I'm covered. Okay, I'm good. So I had so much assurance in that time through that particular passage. And then I would say Luke chapter 9, it's after Jesus comes down from the Mount
Mhm.
of Transfiguration, right? And
Mhm.
he's with a couple of his disciples, and then they meet the man who comes to him and says, Lord, if you are willing, would you please help my son? And the way that the Bible describes the son's illness is not far off from what
Mhm.
pandas and autoimmune encephalitis families endures at all. And so when
Mm.
I read those words, it's not that he, this father, or I don't believe that God can. We're just like, so are you gonna? When
Yeah,
is this
yeah.
gonna happen? It's
Uh-huh.
not that we don't have faith, right? I know God can. I know he can heal my girls from top to bottom. I know he can, but that might not be part of his plan, right? And so
Mm.
thankfully that young man in that story was healed, right? But the point of that is that he sees us. He
Mm.
sees us, even if church congregations don't, even if society don't, even if doctors don't.
Mm.
God sees us and he knows us, and he's with us in it. And then the other part is 2 Timothy 1:12, where he talks about not ashamed of the suffering that you endure,
Wow. Mhm.
but that God has like entrusted this to you until he's revealed in you, or in that day, or maybe the other side, maybe
Yeah.
nowhere near my life right now. But we are in this season for a very for God's purposes, basically, and we
Yeah.
don't understand why it's like that.
Mhm.
But I do believe that God has to use it, because if he doesn't, I don't know what to say then, So those are
Wow.
those things that I cling to
I
in
love
all
that.
of these different circumstances. So
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
Those are so powerful. And I love listening to you. I love hearing how tenderly God just loves us. And even in the smallest
Mhm.
ways that you would, I don't know, receive, you're dwelling on Psalm 91 and someone will give you something with a feather. Like you're so seen and known and loved, like at the depth of your heart that I don't know that exact story, but this is just my imagination that it's not something you had
Mhm.
told a friend, but it was something that was on your heart, and God knows your heart and your
Yeah.
soul, and that He is committed to tenderly caring for you. So those are,
Yes.
oh, those are amazing passages. Well, you are a warrior and just so full of beautiful light. You have obviously, just listening to you, this scripture just keeps running through my mind that we are to take up our cross and to bear
Mhm.
it. And you have obviously done that, that you're not trying to run away from the suffering or hide from the suffering. If anything, you just have really just said, okay, this is mine to bear. And how can I honor God and glorify God through this and be a blessing to other people through this? So that's just really shown
Yeah.
through, Carly. So we really honor you for
Thank
that. And
you.
thank you for
Thank
so
you.
much for being an inspiration to all of us, to all the listeners here at Bold Mercies. And in closing, I love to ask everybody, what is one thing right now making you happy?
Okay, so we recently, I have never had a dog in my adult life, and I've always wanted one. And kind of right in the middle at the beginning of one of our latest crises
Mm-hmm.
of many, right? Um, I decided one day, we're getting a dog. Husband, we are getting a dog. And so he's like, okay. And then I'm not even joking. Within like maybe within the week, I had this little puppy and she was
Oh,
exactly what we needed. It's like God just like,
oh,
here, this friend and this friend, they know this guy. So if you just go through these people, then you're gonna and we have the most perfect sweet puppy, and she's brought so much joy and light into our in the middle of grief and hard times. And
oh, I love
so
that.
that she just makes me smile.
Oh,
So
that is
she's a lot
such a
of
great,
fun.
oh, that is such a great
Yeah,
thing. I love that.
yeah. So
I
that
love
makes me happy right now. So,
Absolutely.
yeah.
If I was in your shoes, that would be making me happy too. I love that. Well, Carly, thanks so much for
Yeah.
joining us on Bold Mercies today. Thank you for being vulnerable and honest and sharing your story. You have truly emboldened all of us. And as we like to say here at Bold Mercies, stories lend strength. And so you have lent strength to all of us today. So thank you so much for being
Thank
with us
you.
today.
Thank you so much for having me. I appreciate it, Heather. Thanks for letting me share.